$1 billion and you'll be safe. But I've got to ask you whether you are prepared, at least in the future, to look at interim possibilities when the only answer the NTSB has been able to come up with since 2004 is spend some money. The public needs to know, hey, short of spending money, do the experts have a response that can increase our feeling of safety when we get aboard the red line that we have no alternative but to board? Could you consider that in the event your recommendation costs a lot of money, and given what you know about resources, would you consider offering recommendations temporary and short of spending the money that could increase safety?
Ms. Norton, it is completely up to the recipients who are the experts in managing their fleet to respond to us.
That's not Ms. Hersman. I'm not going to let you get away with that. It was up to the recipients to change the... No, that's just not fair. It was up to the recipients to buy new cars. You had no hesitation 2 or 3 times telling them when they rolled back, when they rolled forward, to change the cars. That you didn't mince your words on. We're dealing with millions of people who get on these trains, including people who visit the city. We're trying to learn whether or not there is anybody interested in doing what seemed to us to be minimally necessary. If you do not have the money, what do the experts have to say to the system about interim steps? I think that is a fair question, and you either are prepared to look into that or not. And I want to know if you are prepared to look into interim steps such as Mr. Cato has now taken, such as the union apparently advised, neither of which is presumed to have the background and expertise you do. Are you prepared to consider interim steps when the funds are not available to do what you think is the best thing to do? Yes or no?
Yes, and we often consider interim steps. If WMATA had
That's all I need to know.
We're
not trying to second guess anyone. We are trying to be forehanded. We're really not blaming anyone for anything. We think that this accident was so unforeseeable that our only duty here is to say, what little things can we do to make sure this doesn't happen again? Frankly, I think that the victims and the public is entitled to hear any interim step we can take, however minor, besides saying spend a gazillion dollars, which everybody knows WMATA doesn't have, and Ms. Hersman, we don't have it either. I've got to ask you, Mr. Rogoff. The region met House and Senate members, and the first thing we thought of was, goodness, where are the feds? That's us, or you, more specifically. You say in your testimony that the FTA is prevented by law from establishing safety standards, requiring inspections of the kind that are required on other common carriers, etc. What federal law prohibits you from acting?
That specifically...
And do you believe, don't even start to use the word reform the way you did in your testimony, what federal law prevents you from acting, and do you believe that at least that there is an obligation to at least, on our part, you're talking to us now, I know what you don't have, I want to know however where it's found, but do you believe that there is at least a minimal obligation on the part of federal authorities to adopt minimum standards that perhaps states and cities can go beyond, but minimum standards, so that Ms. Hersman knows minimally what is required, so that the operators know what to. Would that not be a reasonable thing for the Congress to do?
Well, we certainly think so. I want to answer both parts of your question. The language that has been both litigated and found by the courts to be most limiting to us is Section 5334B1 of Title 49, and I'm just going to read it because it's short enough. Except for purposes of national defense or in the event of a national or regional emergency, the Secretary may not regulate the operation, routes, or schedules of public transportation systems.
What's the date on that, please?
This has been in law really from the beginning of the Urban Mass Transportation Act, going back a great many years. And
what was the reason that you believe we prohibited ourselves from providing for the safety of the public in rapid transit the way we do in other common carriers?
I think it's twofold, Mrs. Norton. One, from the birthing of these agencies, going back to the birthing of DOT in 1966, UMTA grew up as part of the urban renewal and urban redevelopment agenda in the Johnson administration, and it was thought to be a grant-making agency. And persisted as a grant-making agency.
So should some other federal agency have been charged as more and more, as more and more cities and states develop mass transit systems?
Well, you know, what is developed is sort of a hodgepodge system where we do have commuter rail operations under the Federal Railroad Administration with hundreds of federal inspectors across the country.
So the problem was the transit systems weren't under the usual regulatory agency, the Federal Railroad Administration. We have
those that are said to be off the system of off the National Railroad System, which is to say they're in a closed system. So you even got some operators that run both closed systems, like the MTA in New York runs the New York City subway. They also run the Long Island Railroad and Metro North. Long Island Railroad and Metro North are inspected by the FRA. The subway is not. And where Congress has so typically there must be dozens of subway systems across the nation that just are by the seat of their own pants. Well, 48 systems to be exact in about 28 states, and they are largely, to the extent that they are regulated by these state organizations such as Mr. Madison speaks, and as you heard me say, and Mr. Madison say, Mr. Madison is concerned that party to in their legal statute, and we don't have the ability to even set minimum standards for them. We could set minimum program requirements, but that gets into the issue of available funding. I mean, one of the great concerns that we're looking at as part of, you don't want me to use the reform, but part of our process as we look at this is the scant funding and the scant staffing of those organizations. Now, I'd like to use that just for a second to segue into an issue that Mr. Micah raised, because it's a source of considerable confusion and concern. Mr. Micah is asking the question, well, FTA, why don't you let your grantees use their federal money to provide grants to the SSOs, the state safety organizations? Our simple and first answer to that is that it's a conflict of interest that we don't think we should abide. We do not believe that we would ever want to have a situation where the grantee is using their funds, whether it's through a federal grant or other grants, to pay for the operating costs of their regulator.
Now, that parallels what the Federal Railroad Administration is.
Exactly. In fact, there used to be rail safety user fees that went into a fund. There wasn't a direct dollar-pass relationship, and those fees were repealed by the Congress because they did not want the users to be paying the operating costs of their regulators and inspectors. And that is this. You know, we just had a Southwest flight land with a hole in it about the size of a football, about 12 by 18 last night. It lost compression. The FAA has dozens of inspectors that inspect nothing but Southwest airline aircraft. We would never want Southwest Airlines to be paying the salaries of those inspectors, and I don't think we should necessarily.
So you don't think you're the people who ought to be regulating?
No, ma'am. I guess what I'm saying is we're not comfortable having our grantees use their monies to pay for the inspectors. We think they should be paid for adequately, robustly, but by someone else.
Again, as the money was in our court, I think this issue is in our court. I needed your testimony on the record, however, because if we want to really do something besides put up the money in the future, considering that what happened here could happen, you say in 48 systems, we have an obligation now, now that we know from this experience here. Mr. Madison, my staff was charged with researching issues about this crash, and they informed me that they couldn't even find a website for your agency, the Transit State Oversight Committee, that has the jurisdiction that such as it is, and I understand how minimal it is, that Mr. Rogoff does not have. Why is there such a lack even of public information, letting the public know what it is you do?
The Tri-State Oversight Committee is...
Speak into the...
Sorry. Our committee is formed up of members from each of the 3 jurisdictions. In particular, in relation to the question about the website, we've had some discussion about that because we're not really sure who would maintain the website, what information we would have on there, because
well, you would maintain it. Do you have any staff?
No, I mean our staff. Like, if it would be...
How many staff do you have?
We currently have 8 staff members.
So couldn't you just say you will maintain the website?
Well,
whoever you are.
But the staff are in 3 different jurisdictions. So, and we work out of different agencies. So we're
I see. So you don't. You each works out of a specific. Okay. All right. You DC will do it this year. You Virginia will do it next year. I mean, why is that so difficult to just have a website at least so people can understand what I will confess I did not even know existed. I didn't know we had a regional safety organization.
Okay. Well, we weren't sure that if it was difficult or not. It was something that we hadn't considered in the...
Well, would you consider putting up a website and assigning each jurisdiction a round of duty with respect to that? I understand you're sparsely funded. That goes back to the jurisdictions. Mr. Graham, I mean, you all, I know what you've done had to go through just to get the funds that are necessary in order for us to release the funds. So I won't say how come you haven't been pouring money on this board, particularly since I can't believe we will seek to find out that there's any such board as this that is particularly well funded, given the lack of oversight from the Transportation Administration. I'm sure that people decide to put their money elsewhere. Do you have regulations, Mr. Madison? Are they codified anywhere?
Yes.
What power do you have if you are the only agency that can look at safety?
Yes. In Part 659, there is a stipulation that the State Safety Oversight Agency has to develop what's called a program standard, list of program standards and procedures. The Tri-State Oversight Committee does have a document called the Program Standard and Procedures. And
is that an enforceable document?
No, really what it is it's a document that lays out how we execute how the TOC is executed, but also...
So you don't have any enforcement authorities, is that right? You can't tell them to do anything?
No, ma'am. We
cannot.
You
you did recommend... I can understand your frustration, but apparently you recommended that the FTA withhold 5% of federal grants when WMATA was non-compliant, although you know full well that WMATA didn't have any way to get the money. Wasn't that counterproductive to say, okay, take away their money when they don't have any money? Wouldn't it be better to make some other kind of recommendation?
Actually, the TOC hasn't made a recommendation to withhold funding to WMATA because we understand that
you can do that. Is that
we can do that.
And you have not done that?
No, we have not.
Because you recognize that if that's all they're giving you, they're not giving you any tools. If all they can give you is to recommend that federal funds be withheld, they haven't given you anything to work with. I understand that, nor can the local agencies. So as a practical matter, The reason I haven't much heard, and the public hasn't much heard of this, of your board, is not that you don't desire to do regulation, but you don't have any authority to do any regulation or to maintain the safety of the system or to enforce it, do you?
No, we do not.
I have got to ask Mr. Cato to comment on this testimony about, what we have read, indeed what we heard here in the Congress, unrelated to this accident, about lease backs. Now, first, let me say that, particularly because this hearing isn't about why didn't you do what you should have done, but about trying to explain why some things which may seem strange perhaps aren't, or certainly to give you the opportunity to explain them. But, and therefore I preface this question by saying you are operating with no way, you have been operating with no way to do capital costs, and the only system with no dedicated funding. So somebody, some smart financial person did what has been done all over the country, may indeed have gotten us in this fix. We have been working with you with the fix it got you in, to say, take advantage of the fact that if you go to the banks to own the cars, they will have an incentive to buy the cars because unlike you, Mr. Cato, you'll explain why, they can depreciate cars as they age because they can take the customary loss and write off taxes. So the notion occurs that the longer you keep the cars, from the point of view of the banks, the better for them. This arrangement apparently goes until 2014, and we are informed that if somehow these cars are retired before 2014, look, this is a straight-out money deal. This is not a safety deal. Well, a desperate transit authority with no way to get the money. But correct me if I'm wrong on this, that if you retire these cars before 2014, that the system would have to pay a $250 million penalty. Now, we have a 2006 letter after the NTSB recommendation that Metro replace these cars, where you say WMATA is constrained by tax advantage leases, which require that WMATA keep the 1000 series cars in service at least until 2014. Were these cars in service for tax reasons because you were constrained by the way in which you had to finance the new cars? Or for that matter, what cars you had bought?
Well, let me go a little bit into discussion. In the late 1980s, early 1990s, transit agencies as well as other municipalities such as water districts were able to basically sell their equipment like rail cars and receive a sum of monies for doing that. They took some of the monies and invested those dollars into their systems. A portion of the monies they set aside to make payments, those lease payments back over the number of years that that agreement was in place. That was an agreement that at the time was considered legal and it was encouraged in certain quarters. Since that time, that type of arrangement has been determined to not be legal.
Yeah, I want that to be on the record. At the time you engaged in this way to finance the cars, there was no indication from the IRS or federal authorities that this should not be done?
No, there was no indication at that time.
Indeed, the financial incentive was in fact to do this.
It was a financial incentive for transit agencies and, again, other municipal operations, not just transit, to be able to do that. But to get to your question, and there's many pieces to that, of the 2006 letter in response to the NTSB recommendations on replacement of rail cars, while 2014 was the coverage date under the agreement that we had with various banks on the 1000 series cars, the agreement did allow substitutions. For an example, if we decided to sell the 1000, to replace the 1000 series cars, we could use a newer car to substitute for the time period remaining under that agreement. So the letters sent in 2006 had an error in it.
So you weren't constrained, though, from replacing the cars. But you would not suffer a $250 million penalty?
So long as we have a substitution, no.
Now, did you have any substitution?
Yes, we do have a substitution. So even though that's what the letters said at the time, since that period of time, WMATA has been in the process of replacing those vehicles, of identifying funding sources, as well as developing the specifications for a new series of rail vehicles, which several months ago we did put out the bid, and we have received new bids on those vehicles. If there was a way, if we could replace those cars today, I would replace them and substitute another car until the agreement, the 2014, has arrived. So yes, we could. We could substitute other vehicles.
Mrs. Norton, could I just, I just think it's important to point out for people who may not be familiar with these transactions, this is not a transaction that's unique to WMATA. We've got rail car operators across the country that during the same period that WMATA entered into these transactions did the same thing in order to leverage some additional dollars out of their rolling stock. I just want to clarify that, lest anyone think that this is a Washington Metro unique arrangement.
Indeed, thank you, Mr. Rogoff. In fact, we're aware that when, was it the Swiss bank that called the loan, really taking full advantage of the downturn of the economy, WMATA came here along with virtually every other transit system that was involved, which is every big transit system, to try to get some kind of relief from having to pay essentially penalties by having the loan called so quickly. Is that still a problem?
Well, yes, again, let me go back. What happened, these agreements had to be insured by an insurance company. Just so happened that the majority of the agreements that we had were insured by AIG. And so when the economy
took a dive... Just your luck, Mr. Cato.
See?
Just your luck.
Yes, it's the perfect storm, so to speak. When their rating dropped, we were in technical default. This technical default because the agreements specified that the insurers had to have a certain rating. Well, AIG was not the only one whose ratings dropped. Every other insurance company in the world during this bad economic times, their ratings dropped. And so we and every other transit agency, as well as municipalities and water districts, were in technical default of our agreements. Given that the banks could no longer write off a loss because an interpretation by the Internal Revenue Service that this transaction was not legal, they came after the various agencies demanding payment, even though we have made every lease payment required over the years.
No missed payments.
No missed payments whatsoever. And transit agencies and other municipalities were in danger of losing hundreds of millions, if not several billions of dollars in taxpayers' monies. We came to Congress, and we also went to federal court to block the effort of that bank to do so. We were successful to a certain degree in federal court, and Congress has also been very supportive. We're in the process now, and we have unwind several of these agreements. And we have unwind those agreements for the monies that were set aside for the payments, so no additional costs to the taxpayers. However, there are still multiple agreements here in WMATA as well as across the United States that have not been unwound. And there is congressional action pending to deal with those issues.
Thank you. I'm very sorry you had to go to court on this one. It was a terrible situation. Mr. Kafitz is back, and I'm pleased to ask him if he has any questions. He's back in time to ask questions of this panel.
Thank you. My apologies for being away for during the votes. I appreciate your indulgence and your understanding, and my apologies if I'm hitting something that had been addressed while we were away. Mr. Cato, there was a quote in there from a Metro statement that said, quote, "We'll devote all of our resources," end quote, to developing additional protections. Can you give me some reassurance as to we'll devote all of our resources and what that means specifically?
Well, WMATA has limited capital resources, obviously. Our capital dollars are from Federal 5307 funds, the local jurisdictions commit funds, and we have a capital budget. And there are dollars that we have identified for various programs we plan on doing this year, during the budget year. And my comment was that there is a recommendation that identifies a capital project or need within the agency to ensure the safety of our system for our customers and our employees. I will reprogram those dollars and recommend to the board and move to reprogram those dollars to fund that program.
As you get the first tranche of dollars, where do you anticipate spending that first set of dollars? If you had to prioritize maybe 1, 2, or even 3, what's at the top of your list?
Safety. And
can you be more specific than that?
Implementing the recommendations outlined by the National Transportation Safety Board. That's number one.
Now, my understanding from Ms. Hersman's, and correct me if I'm wrong from what I heard, there have been 76 recommendations along the way. Mm-hmm. How many of those have or have not been implemented? It's not just from this incident, but from past incidents.
If I recall, there are 2 different, this is off the top of my mind.
Sure.
There are 8 recommendations that have not been implemented, 2 from an investigation in 1996, and I believe 6 from an investigation or report in 2006. So my numbers might be slightly off, but I believe there's 8 out of the 70 some odd recommendations.
Ms. Hersman, is that your understanding?
Over the 7 investigations, we've issued 76, and actually with our recs yesterday, 77. And of those, Metro, we have closed the vast majority of those. So there are only 10 of those that remain in an open status now. 8 of them, Metro's continuing to work, to address the concerns that we've raised. They address operating issues, track issues, equipment issues, and 2 of them are classified in an unacceptable status, and they deal with specific track issues.
Sorry to interrupt you with our limited time. Just for the clarification of staff and myself and whatnot, could we get some sort of summary as to which ones have not been implemented, maybe some degree of justification as to why they were not? Let me move on in the essence of time here. Time's short. Mr. Cato, would you encourage writers to record and report negligent behavior? I mean, we've had a couple of those reports in the last couple of weeks. What would you say to writers? And would you encourage that, not encourage that? What should they do or not do?
I've encouraged that since the day I walked in the door. I would encourage any our employees, our customers, anyone to see an operation that they feel is unsafe or that would hinder the operation of this organization to report that.
And how would you assess the morale, and what are we going to do to help those that are working hard and diligent, and they do a good job, but obviously the morale maybe suffers? How would you assess that, and what can we do?
Well, anytime you have an event in an organization such as occurred on June 22nd, the morale is low. But I can share with you also that employees that I have discussed or had a discussion with concerning the videos that most of us have seen on TV or YouTube are angry at those workers because The overwhelming majority of our employees do an outstanding job of providing customer service, and all it takes is one or two or three to ruin the image and the reputation of the entire agency. So morale, of course, is impacted by what occurred, but also there is an anger of those individuals, those few individuals, who obviously are not following our safety procedures and policies.
And finally, let me just ask you, one of the general concerns is the idea of implementing best practices, and to the degree in which you're communicating maybe with counterparts and others to implement those best practices and understand what's working and not working. My time is up, but could you maybe address that and what you're doing and not doing in that regard, and how we could perhaps improve that?
That's, if I understand the general overall question, was the implementation of best practices. And we do. We have a safety, chief safety officer who looks at best safety practice. Our operations staff look at best operations practice is defined by the industry. Excuse me?
How would you grade yourself on that?
I grade ourselves high. I mean, I've not thought about an A or a B in that regard. But again, I want to clarify the definition of best practices. One organization might say their practices are best. I might not agree, and therefore I would not implement those. But as best practices that have been certified through a process, we all move forward and we work towards implementing all of those if they apply to our type of operation.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank the gentleman. I want to thank Ms. Holmes-Norton for pinch hitting for me again. I understand that the Rules Committee is still meeting, so that means Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Connolly are both in the Rules Committee. However, I wanted to follow up on one question. On the 17th, when the I think it was a bond, they called it, in the circuit that was malfunctioning, was replaced, what was done right after that, Mr. Cato, in terms of making sure that it was functioning properly? Is there a testing protocol that has to be implemented? Because it seemed to be at the heart of the problem.
Yes, the repair work, not repair work, the replacement was done on this circuit on June 17th, and at that time it was tested to ensure that it was working properly. Our records indicate that it was working properly at that time. It's the records I have seen. Again, monthly we were running this test to determine whether or not there were problems with any of the circuits in the system. After the accident, post-accident, we did run that test, and it demonstrated and it showed that this particular circuit was fluttering over a period of time up to the accident itself and post-accident.
Yeah, I'm just wondering what happened immediately after you repaired the system on the 17th. I guess
we did. I'm sorry.
No, that's basically it. I know you say your systems indicate that it was acting properly. What do you do to determine that? Do you run a bunch of test trains, or tell me about that?
No, we do not run a bunch of test trains to determine if that particular circuit is running, because we have 3,000 circuits in the system, and we were going through a program to replace all of those circuits. The individual circuit is tested, and again, monthly we test the whole system, but not just replacing that circuit, but other circuits on that line. And we did a site test on the circuit to make sure it was receiving the signals and connected properly.
And where is that operated from? Is that a manual test at the junction, or is it back in the operations room?
I believe it's a manual test at the site, but I'm turning around to look at my rail expert to be sure. I was correct. It's a manual fields test on site.
Okay. My concern, and maybe Ms. Hersman, you can talk about this as well, the more reliant we become on technology, I think the more important it is that we make sure that the technology is operating, because in this instance, there was little indication, I guess, of a malfunctioning circuit that had very grave circumstances for a lot of people here, a lot of families. And, you know, this technology, we're becoming more no fallback or fail-safe measures by which we can determine whether these things are still operating. And, you know, you got trains loaded with people, you know, packed in there, operating at high speeds, and we can't have this level of, you know, malfunctioning, I guess, going on. And we just have to be more vigilant about testing these safety systems to make sure they're working. We see the consequences of this today, but in retrospect, I'm probably a little surprised we don't have these things more often. Maybe I think we just take a lot for granted. And if we're going to rely on these systems to replace operator ability to override the system when it becomes necessary, then we have to make sure these systems, you know, work. Ms. Hersman, I mean, are you seeing a lot more of this in other systems as well? And does the NTSB have recommendations regarding the routine or the regular scheduling of these inspections?
I think the question you're asking has a lot of answers to it, and so one of the things that I want to make sure that we cover is Chairman Graham talked about what happened, you know, after we identified that there were some problems. We've been changing out components. That particular impedance bond that was replaced, we looked at it with a shunt on the track. We looked at it with an exemplar train on the track. We replaced it with a brand new impedance bond. We replaced it with the old impedance bond that was in before. There are still intermittent failures. Sometimes it's working, sometimes it's not, even with those changes. We've walked back, you know, the cable to see if there might be some cabling issues. There are a lot of challenges here, and we're changing out some components and trying to identify what the problem is. That's why the work is still ongoing. But with respect to the redundancy, I think that's what you're raising, you know, a vital system that everyone's relying on to perform. I think that's what our recommendation yesterday was about, is to have a monitoring system so that you know when something fails. You've got to get an alert when something fails. If people are relying on that system to be vital, and 100% of the time it's got to be accurate, you've got to know when there's a malfunction or a loss of detection. They can do that now by looking back at their data. What we want it is for there to be a real-time notification when that happens, that there's an alert. So we've seen this on the pipeline side or on the aviation side. So for example, if you're monitoring a pipeline, you see a loss of pressure, the person who's monitoring that pipeline gets an immediate alert that's aggressive, that it grabs their attention, so they can start shutting that pipeline down if they're having a leak. Air traffic control. If they have aircraft that are coming too close to the ground, they get a low altitude alert on their scopes. Those air traffic controllers are compelled then to tell the pilot, you need to pull up, you know, you're getting low, there's terrain there. What we want to make sure is when the system itself isn't functioning the way it was intended, that there's some way to get notification about that so that you can intervene.
Okay.
Mr. Lynch, can I just speak to one element about it? It doesn't have to do with the specific elements of the technology here, but it's really a more macro observation. You know, earlier Mr. Davis talked about and identified $6 billion in deferred maintenance on the WMATA system. Nationally, we just completed a study for just the 7 largest rail transit operators, including the T in Boston, which indicates we have a $50 billion deferred maintenance backlog. That's just the 7 largest systems. We're updating that study to even incorporate a larger universe of systems. But this is really a more macro issue for reauthorization, because one of the things obviously we see in these studies, Metrorail is a comparatively young system, but the Red Line is the oldest segment. It's 33 years old. Even the newer systems are starting to age, and it makes the need to face the deferred maintenance issue sort of head on, because as we could say generically, not in the context of this particular accident or any other one, but deferred maintenance issues, if deferred long enough, become safety issues. And that's an issue that the administration and the Congress is going to have to take on more broadly.
Thank you. Chair recognizes. We could. What I would like to do is just give, I'm sure we didn't exhaust the full menu of questions to all of you today, but what I would like to do is just to give, if there are some issues that you'd wish to amplify or hit on that members of the panel here have not asked, I'd like to hear those. And as well as I had said earlier with the earlier panel, there are other members here, Mr. Conley, I know Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Cummings, the gentleman from Maryland, and as well as some of the, Mr. Bill Bray and Mr. Issa may want to submit some questions in writing, and so we would ask that you diligently respond to those questions if possible. But I'd like to give you at least a couple of minutes each in closing to hit on the areas that you think are the most important going forward for this system to operate in a reliable and safe manner the way we all would like it to. Mr. Graham, you're recognized for 2 minutes.
I would say just very briefly, Mr. Chairman, that and maybe this demonstrates my keen sense of the obvious, but we need to have the probable cause of this accident identified. And we need to have a preliminary report from the NTSB. If it doesn't pinpoint the precise cause of the accident, it should at least describe what the challenges are that we're facing. Because our experience, Mr. Chairman, is that there's a great deal of half information, misinformation, misleading information, which is, in circulation at the present time. And we would really appreciate from the NTSB, and this is why I took Delegate Norton's time a little bit, to try to focus the issue, because if we could just get the public to understand just what it is that we're wrestling with at this point, I think that would go a long way in reassuring the public that we want to have manual operation, we want 35 mile-an-hour speed limits on the red line, and it would also better focus the discussion of what we're dealing with. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Cato.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe many of the speakers today really from a broad perspective, talked about the issues. As we look at public transportation now and into the future, there must be a balance of system expansion, but with that expansion, an assurance that monies are there to maintain the system. When we look at all capital programs, we can't just look on the side of what are we going to get new and what type of celebration we're going to have because of a new line. But we must also plan for the maintenance of that line for the next decades into the future. And this is a discussion that's going on within the industry today, the state of good repair of the organizations and the systems, and it is something that we must focus on. And finally, in talking about the aspect of oversight, and this might not win me some friends in some places, oversight sometimes might be difficult because it takes time. But if oversight is focused on the safety of a system, to ensure the safety of our customers, then I welcome that. And also to provide the necessary authority on the part of the agencies to have that responsibility to take action.
Ms. Hersman.
I've heard many of the concerns that were raised here today by Congresswoman Norton, Chairman Graham. I will definitely take those back and take them to heart. We make many recommendations based on what we think is best. We don't have to consider cost-benefit analysis when we make our recommendations. And today we held a board meeting determining the probable cause of an accident that occurred up in the Green Line in Newton, Massachusetts. We had a fatal operator that was killed up there last year. We made a recommendation in that board meeting this morning for the Federal Transit Administration and for MBTA to look at putting positive train control on that line. We understand that that's a cost constraint for them. The Green Line is the only line that doesn't have a form of positive train control on it. We know it's their oldest line up there too, and that will be a significant cost to them, but we do believe that that's what's needed to save lives. So we do make recommendations, Ms. Norton, and we don't have to pay for them. And so I do recognize the frustration. But our charge is not to do that part of it. Our charge is to recommend what we think is in the best interest for the safety community. We're the conscience and the compass of the transportation industry, and they get to decide if or how they implement it. With respect to Chairman Graham's concerns, we do have a number of rail investigations that are pending, about 16. We will work very hard to get the cause of this determined. We have another MBTA wreck or another MBTA accident. I was up on Mother's Day for another Green Line accident, and so we have many in the queue. But even if we don't complete a final report on the Metro accident, we will do as we did yesterday when we identify safety issues that are acute in nature. We will issue recommendations to address, whatever improvements we think need to take place. And so we recognize everyone would like us to determine the probable cause of the accident yesterday. We'll work to do it as quickly as we can, but in the meantime, we'll put out recommendations to address the issues we think we need to look at.
Thank you. Mr. Rogoff.
Well, thank you, Mr. Lynch. I mean, I'll certainly echo what Mr. Cato said about the state of good repair. Ironically enough, both the FTA and WMATA had a scheduled roundtable for the whole nation for transit operators on the state of good repair, which was planned several months before the accident, and we hosted it together just last week. I'm glad Member Hersman raised the issue of the Back Bay recommendation, because it's very telling on this whole issue about whether we need to reform the legal authorities as it relates to safety enforcement. Her recommendation, or I should say the board's recommendation to the FTA, is to facilitate the installation of positive train control. The reason why it says facilitate is because we are not allowed by law to mandate it. At the very same time, the Federal Railroad Administration is moving a regulation to mandate positive train control on the rail operators on the systems that they inspect and they have the legal authority over. So it really brings to a head the legal issues we're raising here. Now, we've talked a lot here about the FTA model versus the FRA model, and I want to emphasize there are other models out there that may be appropriate for a reformed Federal Transit Administration. Within the Federal Motor Carrier System, the Motor Carrier Safety Administration, within pipeline safety, we provide federal funds to state enforcement agents so they would be adequately resourced to not only enforce state regulation but also federal regulation. So, we recognize the need to take a hard and fresh look at these legal authorities, but we don't want to just run out and say we need to federalize this right away. We will be back to Congress in a few weeks with a reform plan that tries to capture the best model for this particular industry that works with our state partners as best we can. Thank you.
That's good. Thank you, Mr. Rogoff. Mr. Madison.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just reiterate from the SSO standpoint the need for funding and legislation that actually gives the SSO some authority. There are currently 27 SSOs throughout the country, and I've met most of them, and they're really good people, and we don't want to imply by anything that's been said to say that the lack of authority doesn't mean that there isn't a lack of effort on the part of the people who work in the SSOs. They work very hard with the resources that they have, and we try to make our systems as safe as possible.
Thank you. We want to thank you for your willingness to come before this committee and offer your testimony to help us. Just in closing, we all have a special responsibility here. Running a public transit authority is a very serious responsibility. We had nine people who went out to work one morning, like we all do every day, got on the Metro and put their trust in the system, probably not giving it a second thought because of the level of trust that was built up in that system over the years. And because of failure in the system, members of the public were killed. Those families are dealing with those consequences, and there were dozens of riders that were hurt that day and still have not recovered. Those are very serious consequences when we don't run a system as well as we should. And so, you know, I think that everyone's heart and mind is in the right place on this and what we need to do. But it is a serious business, and hopefully with the injection of resources brought in by Ms. Norton and by Mr. Conley and Van Hollen and Mr. Hoyer and Mr. Cummings and others, some of those needs will be met, but it will require our diligence to make sure that that money is spent properly and that our priorities are what they should be. And, you know, we thank you all for the role in this that you play in making it safer for the riding public. And, you know, we'll just continue to work with you as we move forward and trying to improve the system for everyone. Thank you very much. Appreciate your testimony today, and we bid you good day.